In the year of 1978, David Gray of Illinois was convicted and sentenced to 60 years for a crime that he did not commit. In 1999, justice prevailed and David Gray was exonerated. He was also able to receive restitution and compensation for his wrongful incarceration. It all began on March 29, 1978, when Ann Brewer of Alton, Illinois, was selling her motorcycle at her home. A man came over to Ann's house inquiring about the sale of her motorcycle. However, he ended up raping her at knife point, stabbing her, and leaving her to die. However, miraculously, she survived. At the time of the crime, David Gray was labeled as a suspect due to his proximity of the crime and the fact that he did have prior sex offenses on his record. It is also critical to note that David Gray is a black male and Ann Brewer is a white female. Police gave Mrs. Brewer and her neighbor a lineup of suspects to make an identification from. However, David Gray's photo was noticeably smaller than the rest of the suspect's photo. As a result, Ann Brewer and her neighbor both chose David Gray out of the suspects as the perpetrator, and then subsequently, in the next lineup, they chose his photo again. At this time, David Gray did give an alibi for the crime, which was corroborated by 5 people, including his mother, his girlfriend, and his girlfriend's parents. Based just on Ann Brewer's identification, David Gray was charged with rape, attempted murder, and armed robbery. However, his trial ended up in a hung jury and he was retried. At the retrial, the only black juror was removed from the jury, and a new jailhouse informant was introduced into the trial. This jailhouse informant claimed that David Gray confessed to the crime while sharing a jail cell with him. There are several contributing factors to David Gray's exoneration, including DNA evidence. However, there's also mistaken witness identification, false or misleading forensic evidence, perjury or false accusation, and official misconduct. There were several flaws throughout David Gray's entire case. Research by Dysart and colleagues shows that historically, biased identification procedures are one of the main sources of incorrect identification in lineups. In addition, research by Dysart and colleagues shows that there are several cases in which wrongfully convicted men are exonerated because of DNA evidence. However, specifically in over 80% of these cases, the leading cause of wrongful conviction has been due to errors in identification. Although we can't for sure tell why Miss Brewer and her neighbor chose David Gray out of the lineup, other than his picture being obviously smaller than the rest of the suspects, one thing that shouldn't have happened was a subsequent lineup. Research by Dysart and his colleagues show that the risk of misidentification increases if a subsequent lineup is shown after the initial lineup and someone already chooses a suspect out of the lineup. There's also a racial bias that is clearly going on in this case, considering that the only black juror was excused from the jury. And this is also a case of a black defendant and a white victim. Now, research by Eberhardt and colleagues explores the rates of capital punishment for crimes like this with black defendants and white victims. And sadly, his research determined that race can influence the prosecution process. This can be interpreted as a type of intergroup conflict. It is also possible that Mrs. Brewer and her neighbor had a stereotypical view of black men, and that is why they chose David Gray out of the suspects. And also, there seemed to be a confirmation bias because David Gray was chosen as a suspect because of his previous crimes, and he was located next to the crime, so that just fit the prosecution and the police's perfect picture of the suspect. Thankfully for David Gray, justice was prevailed, and he was able to be free. However, it is important that we learn from these mistakes so we can prevent these types of wrongful convictions in the future.